Okay, hey guys, so welcome to chapter 1. So in this chapter, we're going to start looking at cells, the basic building blocks of life. Now, the first part we're going to cover today, and then the other parts we're going to cover in a few other videos as well. Okay, so let's just jump straight into it. Okay, this is chapter 1, cells, the basic units of life on Earth. Okay. The building blocks, definition of a cell, the most basic functioning unit of life on Earth. There are a few principles of looking at cell theory, and these are the principles of what we understand and know about the basic things about cells, okay? The first is that all organisms, that is every living thing, to be classified as a living thing, you need to be made up of cells. And cells is the basic unit of structure and organization. Yeah, you could think of it as one of the blocks or a Lego block in a figurine, okay? And cells come from pre-existing cells. Yeah, that is, cells divide and they multiply and reproduce to form other cells. The term organism is referring to any living thing, and there are a few criteria that make up living things, but we're not going to go through that for the sake of today. Okay. Now, here's a diagram of two different types of cells. One's an animal cell and one is a plant cell. And I'm just going to outline a few key things about cells. Yeah. Even though they are the most basic things or the basic building blocks of an organism, they aren't the most smallest things. Yeah. So the cells themselves are made up of different components, and each component has a particular function. So here is a a diagram of an animal cell, and here's a diagram of a plant cell. You can see there are some similarities and a few differences, okay? The first similarity you'll notice is that both cells have what we call a nucleus. Now, all cells belonging to a particular classification of organisms have a nucleus, which is where they store their DNA, yeah? You've got one in the plant, and you've got one in the animal there. The cell also has a few other things: cytoplasm, ribosomes, mitochondria, cell membrane, chloroplast, vacuole, and cell wall. These three being found mainly in plant cells and not in animal cells, which is what makes plants different from animals. We are going to look at them more carefully in the later chapters, but this is just to give you a bit of an overview to the cell, what they do, and some parts of the cell, how it functions, okay? Now, let's talk about size. Typically, cells are microscopic. They're not visible with the naked eye. That's what microscopic means. And most animal cells sit between 10 and 40 micrometers. Now, to give you a bit of a scale, micro meaning 1 in 1 million. So 1 in 1 millionth of a meter. Yeah, so it is 1,000 times smaller than a millimeter, okay, which is a micrometer. The plant cells can get a little bit larger, between 10 and 100 micrometers, and microbial cells, that is bacteria and small single-celled organisms, are often sitting at about 0.4 to 2 micrometers, so even smaller than that of animal cells, okay? Here is a diagram showing the different scales of different objects. Now, this scale here is a slightly ranging from 0.1 nanometers, which is 1 in 1 billionth of a meter, 0.1 nanometers, all the way up to 1 meter. So when we look at human adults, we usually look at them in the frame of meters. You know, if you're talking about a person's height or a person's size, we often refer to that in meters. The largest known single cell would be the ostrich egg, which sits at about 100 millimeters, or roughly, shy of 10 centimeters. Yeah, you got your chicken egg getting a bit smaller. Frog egg sits about 1 millimeter or so, and then you get to around about this region here, between 10 and 100 micrometers for plants and animal cells. The human egg in females sits at about there, and then you get smaller to the size of things like bacteria, which sits at about 1 micrometer. That U there represents micrometer. 1 micrometer, which is the same size as one of the organelles or units within an animal cell. Viruses are even smaller, pieces of protein or pieces of fat, and then you've got your atom, which is even smaller than that. Yeah. To view some of these things, we have different ranges for them. Yeah, the naked eye can probably see down to about 100 micrometers. Anything beyond that, you need to start using a microscope. Yeah, and we have two different types. You've got your light microscope, used for identifying things down to about 100 nanometers, and then you've got your electron microscope, which works like a light microscope. However, rather than using light to illuminate, it uses electron or a ray of electron beam to actually identify. Yeah, and that goes down right down to the atomic level. Okay. Once again, same thing in sizes. There's a human egg, human sperm, skin cell, red blood cell, and then the yeast, which is what we put in our bread to make it rise. If you go even smaller than that, there's your yeast. There are things smaller than the yeast in the red blood cell, your mitochondria, bacteria, E. coli bacteria, and then you can get even smaller viruses, ribosomes, mitochondria, HIV, influenza, and things like that. Now, let's talk about why cells generally get so small. Yeah, what is the benefit of being small? Now, when we are looking at biology, we don't just sort of say, this is it, and this is just the way it is, but there are kind of reasons behind that, which present certain advantages or disadvantages to the organism or trade-offs, and it's worth thinking about these concepts as to why they are the way that they are, rather than just accepting the fact that humans are made of cells and cells are small. So let's talk about why cells are so small. I'm going to use a bit of an analogy. So here you've got a bunch of potatoes, right? Now, let's take a look at how we usually prepare and cook potatoes. When you boil a potato, often, hopefully, if you've ever done that before, you realize that before you often boil the potato, the quicker thing to do, especially if you're trying to do things like mash or potato chips or something like that, is to actually cut it up into smaller sizes first, okay? And so the advantage of doing that is that when you cut the potato into smaller sizes, you are effectively, and you throw it in the hot water, you're giving the hot water more areas to actually reach the insides of the potato and to cook it faster. Yeah, and so that's a particular process that you use to prepare potatoes when you boil them. If you threw the whole potato in there at once, it's going to take a bit of time before the complete inside, the right in the center, is going to cook. And so that is going to be slower. Yeah. So in terms of functionality or usefulness, it is not that useful to leave a potato whole before you boil it. Okay. Now, if you can imagine cells being like that, every time you cut the potato up into smaller pieces, that is like a cell or an organism dividing its body into smaller cells rather than using bigger cells. Why do organisms go to small cells? It is all around this concept of what we call surface area to volume ratio. Okay. For cells to survive, they need to be able to do a few things. Yeah, a few of those things include taking in nutrients and then removing the waste efficiently. Yeah. When cells are larger, however, what we find is that to get to the center of the cell, to move material in and out of the cell from the center to the very edge, it takes a longer period of time. It is not efficient for a cell to be large or have a large surface area to volume ratio to remove waste and to take in nutrients, right? Just like how it takes a long time for heat to reach the center of the potato when it is whole compared to when it is cut up and divided, right? And so when that happens, cells become really inefficient at taking in nutrients and removing wastes, right? And if you were to do the maths, we can calculate this, and you can actually work this out, right? When you are looking at the surface area of, say, for example, a cube, what you are working out is the surface area of one panel, and then you multiply that by 6 because the cube has 6 panels around the outside. Yeah, there's 3 shown here and 3 behind the scenes that you can't really see, right? And so you can figure out its surface area as a result of that. You can also calculate the volume, and the more surface area to volume ratio a cube or a cell has, the more efficient it is to be able to move things in and out. Okay, so let's do the maths and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so here is a cube. Let's say this cube is 1 unit wide, yeah, like 1 centimeter, for example. Okay, so the length of the side is 1 centimeter. That means that this front dark green panel here is 1 by 1, and therefore that is 1 centimeter squared. If you have 6 panels, that's 6 centimeters squared. Okay. However, the volume is calculated by multiplying the length times the width times the height or depth of the cube, right? And so if I go 1 times 1 times 1, I've got a cube that is 1 centimeter cubed, right? The surface area of the cube is 6, the volume of the cube is 1, and so the ratio between the surface area and the volume is 6 to 1. Okay, now I don't need your maths to be brilliant to figure this out, but what this is basically saying is for every centimeter cubed of the cube, there is 6 panels exposed to the outside. Okay, here you've got a cube that is now doubled in size in terms of its length, and so instead of 1 unit, it is 2 units. Yeah, so that's 2. You can calculate once again the surface area. 2 times 2 is 4, so this panel here is 4 centimeters squared. You've got 6 of them, so 4 times 6 is 24 centimeters. So the surface area of this panel now is 24 centimeters squared. However, if we look at the volume, you go 2 times 2 times 2, length times width times depth or height, and you've got 8 in total for its volume. So now you've got a cube that has 24 centimeters squared of exposed surface area, but only 8 centimeters squared, cubed of volume. What that means is that the surface area to volume ratio is now 24 to 8, which if you simplify it gets down to 3 to 1. Now, notice the difference here. At 1 by 1 by 1, this cube has a 6 to 1 surface area to volume ratio. At 2 by 2 by 2, that number drops dramatically, into about half what it was previously, This cube has 6 panels exposed for every 1 cubic centimeter. This one has only 3 areas exposed for every cubic centimeter. So, in terms of efficiency, if I was to ask you the question, which cube would be more efficient as a cell, you would have to say that the first one is, because it is smaller. It's more exposed to the outside environment than the second one. The larger you go, the smaller this number becomes, If it was 3, it drops down to a ratio of 2 to 1, which means you're even more inefficient. And then at 4, you've got a ratio of 3 to 2, which if you simplify is 1.5 to 1. So it's becoming more and more inefficient in taking in nutrients and releasing waste. Okay. Now this might be a bit complicated if you don't do the maths, but that's sort of looking at surface area to volume ratio. This principle guides a lot of areas in biology. You're going to keep coming back to the idea of surface area to volume ratio, and it explains why animals are made up of millions of cells rather than 50 cells or hundreds of cells. It's millions because those millions of tiny cells are more efficient at taking in nutrients and removing waste than having a few really big cells. Okay, that's a really good guiding principle as to how we understand size. It also helps us understand why, for example, trees tend to produce lots and lots of branches rather than have one giant stump with a giant bush. They've got branching out to increase the same principle of surface area to volume ratio. That's why your lungs and your intestines have a very large surface area to volume ratio, so they can maximize the amount of nutrients you're getting into your body and the amount of waste you're removing from your body as well. Okay. Basically, to sum it up, the idea is that if you have big cells, it is actually not efficient. Organisms would generally lean towards having more cells that are smaller than less cells that are larger, because being big essentially sucks. As it grows in size, its volume and surface area increases, but not at the same rate. Volume increases faster than surface area, and that means the more surface exposure the cell has to its surroundings, the more efficient it is at exchanging material, waste, nutrients, gases, etc. Okay? The larger the cell is, the slower the rate of movement of nutrients into and waste out of the cell. And beyond a given size, it actually becomes too inefficient, and so the cell has to do one of two things. It needs to start dividing and becoming two smaller cells again, or it has to die, because it actually is too inefficient to be able to sustain those changes. Okay, high surface area to volume ratio generally is good for cells, and low surface area to volume ratio is bad. Now there are a few exceptions to this rule, but we're going with this kind of general principle to guide our understanding of cells at the start of this chapter. Okay. Here are a few questions that you can go ahead and have a go at doing. These questions are pulled straight from your textbooks, so you can have a go at that, and then we're going to move on to the next part. You can pause the video, have a go at answering some of these questions. Very straightforward, and then we'll go through some of the answers together in class. Okay. Now, I want to talk about the next topic, looking at different classifications on types of organisms based on the cellular structure. Cellular meaning cells, and then you've got two particular categories here. Unicellular, uni meaning single, so a unicellular organism is a organism that only has one cell. It is a bacteria or a protist or some sort of thing that is only one cell large, and the whole organism is made up of only one cell. And you've got what we call multicellular organisms, which have many cells to form that particular organism. You and I fall under this category of multicellular because you are made up of millions of cells compared to a piece of bacteria, which is only one cell. Okay. There are advantages to being both, okay? A unicellular organism, being only one cell, is kind of like a lone ranger, yeah? What that means is that when the organism takes in nutrients and remove waste, it can do that quite efficiently because it's only by itself. It only needs to consider its own needs rather than the needs of its neighbors, and quite simply, it can live off its immediate surroundings. It doesn't take a lot of nutrients to feed one cell. It doesn't take a lot of time to remove the wastes from one cell, okay? However, if you have millions of cells, the entire organism then has to function in a way that allows that movement of nutrients and waste in an effective manner. Yeah. Not only does the cell have to produce nutrients or collect nutrients for itself, it needs to collect nutrients for all of its communal or colonal cells that form the organism. And so there are advantages there, right? And so they need complex systems to transport these nutrients and waste. And that's what you and I have. We have these very complex methods of moving things like oxygen around our body so that our cells can stay alive. We have complex systems to take nutrients from our food in order for us to get all of the nutrients for every single cell in our body to survive and to stay healthy. Okay. It also means that different cells have to have different roles. And so there are these advantages that, in a unicellular organism, that one cell needs to be able to do everything from collecting nutrients, removing wastes, reproducing, and et cetera, et cetera. In a multicellular organism, there's a thing called specialization. Yeah. In other words, giving certain roles to certain cells. Yeah. Your brain cells, for example, have a different role from your heart cells, which also have a different role from your muscle cells or your liver cells or your kidney cells. And so there's an opportunity or a thing for these cells to have specialization, that is, adopting different roles that work together to form these complex systems. And that's an advantage that multicellular organisms have over unicellular. However, once again, they can't live off the immediate surroundings, and they rely on essentially teamwork to function. Okay. The best analogy I can sort of offer to you guys is thinking about a city. A multicellular organism like you and I are really more like a big city, an entire society of people that work together to make society function. Okay, if you were to live by yourself out in the countryside, if you needed food, you would then need to go and hunt for the food. If you needed shelter, you need to then go and build your own shelter. If you needed water, you have to collect your own water. And if you need to remove the waste, you have to remove any sort of waste all by yourself. Okay. Now, there are advantages of that because you only think about yourself and how you live and how you need the stuff you need, and you don't have to think about anybody else's mess. However, the disadvantage is that in a big society or a big city, what you've got specialization. You've got specialized people who think about the process of collecting food, farmers, agriculture, and livestock. You've got certain people who think about waste removal, treatment plants, and things like that. You've got certain people who think about governance and politics and things like that. And so each section of society has a particular role, and in the same way, you can think of each organ in your body as being that kind of section of your body that is in charge of a particular role. Yeah, your digestive system, which contains your stomach, your intestines, have a role of collecting nutrients from your food and then distributing it and passing it to for example, your blood, which then transports it around the body so that every cell in your body can get the nutrients that you've collected from your digestive system. Yeah, that is the same kind of method that you would think about of how society functions with different sections or sectors in society. Yeah, transport, education, politics, law, etc., etc. Okay. We're going to finish up this particular topic. You'll notice that at the end of a particular section in your textbook, there are always these key ideas. I'm going to read this one out to you, but from now on, what I would be expecting is every time you sort of read through your chapter, you want to stop at the key ideas and make sure that you understand each of these key ideas and that it makes sense to you. Not everything will be covered in our PowerPoints, but for the most part, the key ideas will be covered in our talks and things like that. Okay, so the key ideas for this first section is that understanding the cells are the basic structural and functional units of life. They're typically too small to be seen by the unaided eye and are therefore microscopic. We can measure them using a range from micrometer to nanometers, which is micrometer, which is 1 millionth, to nanometers for smaller things. Microbial cells are smaller than plant and animal cells. The metabolic needs of a cell are determined by the cytoplasmic volume. Now, that is referring to surface area to volume ratio, being able to transport nutrients and waste into and out of the cell. They've just used fancy words. The ability of a cell to meet its metabolic needs is determined by the surface area of the cell, basically how exposed it is to its environment to collect nutrients and to remove wastes. And as the cell increases in size, its internal volume expands at a greater rate than the area of its plasma membrane. That is, the volume increases faster than the surface area. And so surface area to volume ratio plays a really important role in determining what the object can do or the cell can do, The continued decrease in surface area to volume ratio increases in size, reaches an upper limit on the cell. That is, the cell can no longer function beyond a certain point. Okay, those are the key ideas that we've just covered. Go ahead, go back over and read over the chapter to make sure you guys understand what it's looking at. Okay, so that's it for this particular section in this video. I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll catch you guys next time. So, I kind of forgot to talk about the last 3 slides in this PowerPoint, so I'm just going to quickly go back over them again. My apologies, guys. I kind of thought that was the end of it, and I just stopped the video halfway. We're going to look at cell design. Okay, so this is mainly looking at 2 particular categories of how we organize and classify organisms based on their cellular structure, okay? And those 2 types of organisms are called prokaryotic and eukaryotic, okay? These words are going to reappear throughout the rest of this chapter every time we look at organisms and cells, because they are the very distinct differences between how we classify life according to these 2 types, okay? So there are 2 types of cells out there. You've got the prokaryotic cells and you've got the eukaryotic cells. Here's a diagram to show the 2 different types, okay? And they're characterized by different organelles, that is, different units of structure within the cells that determine what they are, okay? Here is a eukaryotic cell, and here is a prokaryotic cell and an overview, okay? There are a few distinct differences, okay? The first one you should be able to notice is that the eukaryotic cell looks a lot more complex than the prokaryotic cell. That's because it is more complex, okay? Eukaryotic cells are generally more complex in structure than your prokaryotic cells. These are more basic, and they're also probably more common. However, these ones are more sophisticated in structure, but are less common in terms of the ones that we do know, okay? Similarities and differences. The structure, there are more structures within the eukaryotic cells than there are in the prokaryotic cells. They each have different, what we call organelles, which are units of structure within the cell, or functioning units within the cell. And also the main difference, which we'll go through in more detail, is that the eukaryotic cell has what we call a nucleus, that is something to hold its DNA, whereas the prokaryotic cell does not have that nucleus, and the DNA sort of floats within the nucleoid of the prokaryotic cell, okay? Let me start with prokaryotic cells to give us a better understanding of what we are, which are eukaryotic organisms, okay? The term karyon means nut or kernel, and the term pro meaning before, okay? So if you were to put it together, a prokaryotic cell is prokaryon, before the nut or the kernel. Now the nut or the kernel in this case is referring to the membrane-bound organelles, Each of those structures within the cell have a kind of a surrounding membrane that encases them, okay? And so a prokaryotic cells does not have those membrane-bound organelles. So the main thing that a prokaryotic cells will lack is that it has no nucleus. It doesn't have a nucleus, and it doesn't have other structures, including the mitochondria and the chloroplast. That's important for you to remember because those are the defining characteristics of a lot of the cells, okay? The nucleus, where they store the DNA, okay? The cell structure is characteristically basic. It's not sophisticated or complex. It's very basic in comparison. And prokaryotic cells include things like the bacteria and another classification of organisms called the archaea, which are like your prehistoric version of bacteria. Okay, those are the main characteristics of a prokaryotic cell, and you'll come across a few examples of it here and there as we go. Okay, the second category are the eukaryotic cells. The word EU meaning true, and the karyon meaning nut or kernel. So true nut or kernel, or referring to cells that have membrane-bound organelles such as a nucleus, a mitochondria, and a chloroplast, and they've got complex cell structure. Okay, eukaryotic organisms are basically all the stuff that you typically are able to see: animals, plants, fungus, and protists, which include things like algae and protozoans and things like that. Okay. Those are eukaryotic cells. They have a complex cell structure in comparison to the prokaryotic cell, and they have things like the nucleus to store the DNA, mitochondria for energy, and chloroplast for photosynthesis. Okay, and so those are the differences between them, and there are similarities and differences between them. The older cells are typically prokaryotic. They're usually small and simple. They don't have nucleus, they don't have organelles, and they're usually single-celled with a circular piece of DNA or chromosome called a plasmid. Okay. The eukaryotic cells were kind of more sophisticated versions of prokaryotes, having evolved from prokaryotes, are larger and more complex, contain your nucleus, contain the different organelles, can be single-celled or they can be multicellular, and they have multiple chromosomes which form your DNA. Yeah, both have genetic information. Yeah, at the core of it, both cells have genetic DNA, and they also have other things like ribosomes and cytoplasms, but obviously one is more complex than the other. Okay, and so that's really important to understand. Whenever you think of something that you are able to see, usually that's a eukaryotic cell, yeah, a eukaryotic organism like an animal or a plant. And if it's multicellular, it's always a eukaryotic. Okay, usually your prokaryotic ones are your bacteria and your single-celled organisms, and your eukaryotic ones are your more sophisticated, complex structured organisms. Okay, so that's that. Here's your holiday homework. You can go ahead and read the rest of the chapter. Make sure you watch some of those videos to get yourself sort of up to date, but making sure once again you are also keeping track of your own questions, and we're going to pick up on the rest of it after your holidays. Okay, thanks guys, see ya.